Holly with Stella Mari's Quilts. Welcome to our series on 50 blocks for 50 states, following along with the designs from this book. Make sure you check out the description box below. It has the link for this book as well as the link for the pattern that we've written that includes step-by-step instructions, diagrams, and any adaptations that we've made to make these blocks a little easier to make. So today we're working on the block for Minnesota. So grab a cup of tea and let's get started. For the Minnesota block, we're going to be making 3 different units. For the first unit, we're going to do quarter square triangles, and we're going to use these 7.5 by 7.5 inch squares. You'll need 2 from your dark and 2 from your medium. I've got them stacked up together here. For the center, we're going to do a square and a square. For that, we're going to use a 3.5 of our medium, and then we're going to use 2-inch squares of our light to make a square and a square unit. And then we're going to do some kind of sashing type pieces using these diamonds, and we're going to use these rectangles to turn these into, a sashing piece. The rectangles are 2.5 by 4.5, and the diamonds are 3.25 inch tall. So I'm going to show you how to cut those diamonds really quick here. To cut the diamonds, we're going to take our strip of fabric. This strip is 3.25 inches tall, and we're going to line it up on our mat right into the corner. Let me move that up a bit so you can see better. And on our 60-degree, actually, why don't I rotate this so we can see my degrees better? We're going to line this up where the 60-degree line is here. We're going to put the point of the corner of our strip right into the corner where that point is. And then we're going to line up our ruler. Along that 60-degree line. Make sure it stays in the corner. And we're going to trim. Then we're going to measure in 3.25 inches from this angled cut. So 1, 2, 3.25. The nice thing about doing diamonds is that whatever height your strip is, that's how far in you're going to measure from the angle to get a 60-degree diamond. Go ahead and do that and cut, and then I'm going to line up my other one here. 1, 2, 3.25. Get that nice and lined up. And then there we go. So I already had 2 cut. I just cut the remaining 2 that I needed. You'll know that it was cut correctly if you can fold it in half and your points meet up here and the points of the side meet up as well. You'll know that you cut it all nice and perfect. So let's go ahead and get started with Minnesota. The first thing we'll do is we'll just start with our center unit. That's going to be our easiest one to work on. So we've got our 3.5 by 3.5 inch square, and we're going to turn this into a square and a square. To do that, I'm going to draw a line on the back of my light 2-inch squares here. And if you can eyeball this at your machine, I actually can eyeball it myself. You could just eyeball it. You could also press wrong sides together. It's easier to stitch into the ditch than if you're trying to stitch across the fold. So we'll draw that line. We're going to put 1 square in one corner, and 1 in the opposite corner. We're going to sew on the drawn line, and then we will trim off excess fabric. Now that I've sewn down on the drawn line, I'm going to trim away 1/4 inch from the drawn line from my seam, just to trim away the seam allowance and get rid of some of that extra bulk. I'm going to go ahead and press this back, being careful not to stretch it because that is now a bias. And I'm going to repeat the process on the other 2 corners with my remaining 2-inch squares. So I've already drawn the line on the back. I'm going to go and I'm going to sew down that line. I'll trim and then press the unit. And there's our square and a square unit. That's going to end up as the center of our block. The next thing we're going to work on are our sashing pieces. For that, we're going to need our diamonds. Whoops, that's not a diamond. Here, our diamonds. And we're going to need our 2.5 by 4.5 inch rectangles. What we're going to do is we're going to take our rectangles. We're going to cut them in half from corner to corner. I need 2 of those. And then we're going to sew them onto our diamonds. Let me just rotate that around. So they end up like this. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to find the center. What I want is to have this edge here be 1/4 inch and mark my seam allowance. So I'm going to just kind of center this, and then I'm going to sew down this side, and I'll add one to the other side, press it back, and then we'll add the remaining 2. A note about cutting your rectangles for putting together with your diamonds, you'll want to cut half of them so that they're coming from the top left to the bottom right, and the other half top right to the bottom left. You'll need the right sides and the left sides, and these rotated around to become the same piece, and these rotated around become the opposite direction. So just kind of keep that in mind while you're doing your cutting so that you have all of the pieces that you actually need. Now that I have the triangles sewn to my diamond on these 2 opposite sides, I'm going to take my other triangles. I'm going to do the same process to the remaining 2 sides. Just some things to kind of look at before I do that. This edge here is extended out about 1/4 inch. And then when I'm putting the next triangle on, this edge, this point right here is going to be my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And as I travel on down, this is pretty much going to be my 1/4 inch seam allowance as well, down at this point. So just kind of checking those things as you're getting things ready to go. You could trim off this extra fabric where these hung over if you want at this point. I'm just going to wait and do it at the end. And this is what the sashing unit looks like. Now we're just going to go ahead and trim it so that it's the right size. There's not much to trim off. We're going for 6.5 by 3.5. So as you can see, it really is pretty much right on. I'm just going to shave a little bit with all the excess here. So I'm looking to see that I have 1 3/4 at the points here and here, and then 3 1/4 here and here. Just try and keep it as centered as I can. And I will go ahead and just barely shave a little bit off of that side. And then rotate it around and do my final trim. I want to make sure I'm leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance over here. And then I'll just check the back and see if there's any more excess fabric that I could potentially trim off. Like there's a little bit of excess here that I could just trim with my scissors. And that's just because I didn't trim straight to the edge of my diamonds as I was putting it together. It's not a lot of bulk, but you know, take a minute to just trim those off. So you're going to make 4 of these units. Now we're going to move on to our last unit, which is a 1/4 square triangle. To do that, we are going to draw a line from corner to corner on the back of either one of your fabrics, whichever one you prefer. The line's going to show up about the same on my dark as it is on my medium, so I'm just going to use my dark here. Draw a line down corner to corner. I will pair this with my medium, and then I'm going to go ahead and sew down on both sides of the drawn line, and I'm going to do that to both my sets. Now that I've sewn down on both sides of the drawn line, I'm going to cut this apart down the center here, right on that drawn line. I'm going to press these back towards the dark. You can press this with an iron if you want to. I'm going to just use my finger here and do a finger press. Just being careful not to stretch it. And then I'm going to put these two together so that the dark is on the medium and the medium is on the dark. I'm going to match up that seam. You can feel it with your finger that it's butted up right next to each other, nicely tight and nested. I'm going to draw another line from corner to corner so that the line goes across where my seam is. It can help if you can start at the center and push your way out. Less shifting can happen when you do that. You can also check to see that your 1/4 square triangle will come out by just folding back the corner, and you can see by doing this we will end up with 2 1/4 square triangles out of this piece and then 2 from the other set. Now that I've sewn down on both sides of the drawn line, I'm going to go ahead and cut this apart. And if I open that up, you'll see I have my 1/4 square triangle. I'm going to go ahead and square this though before I press it. To square it, I'm going to use my Clearly Perfect slotted trimmer, the trimmer A, which this is the max that this trimmer will go to, is 6.5. But I've got my stitch line going across here, lined up with their stitch line, and I have their center line lined up with the stitch line from that center seam. And then I'm just going to go ahead and very carefully make sure try to stay lined up because it kind of shifted there. And I'm going to just trim. I'm going to trim my notch here. I'm going to trim down the side there. Trim my notch. Oh, didn't want to trim. And then I'll press that open. If you don't have a clearly perfect slotted trimmer and you need to square with just a regular squaring tool, you can use your square and watch your 45-degree line here. We're going for a 6.5-inch square, so my 45 is along my seam line, and I'm going to watch that my 3¼ inch point comes right to the center. That way I know that everything's going to be nice and centered. And this is a 6.5-inch square, so I've got my point out here, which is matching up with my seam line there and there. And then I can just go ahead and trim and trim. And then I'll just rotate it, line everything up again. Just get it nice in place. And square. There we go. There's not a lot to trim off. So when I was doing my sewing along the drawn lines, I did a very scant 1/4 inch, so I'd have a little bit more wiggle room to trim. It is a very precise measurement at that 7.5 starting square, but there you go. Now we're going to lay out the Minnesota block. So I'm going to start with my square and a square for the center, and then I'm going to put my diamond units rotating off from the center. And I'm going to put my 1/4 square triangle units in the corners. Couple things to pay attention to is that position of your 1/4 square triangle units. The mediums are all going in the same direction, where they're all kind of going in this line here, and the darks are all going in the line here where they point to the centers. They don't actually rotate. And now it's just a matter of sewing this together like a 9 patch. So I'll sew this row together, then this row together, and then this row together, and then I'll just sew all of my rows together, and we'll have our finished block. And here's the finished Minnesota block. Thank you for joining me today working on the Minnesota block. This block was a lot of fun. It finishes off at 15 inches, which is the larger size for the series. I hope you enjoyed this and you continue to follow along in our journey through all 50 states. Until next time, cheers and happy quilting.